The writings of Gato, former third commander of the Defari Expeditionary Force. The distant stars of the Terran night sky still unsettle me, even after 7 Earth cycles of residence. When I step outside my dwelling on the outskirts of what humans call Colorado Springs, I recognize none of the celestial patterns that guided my ancestors. Yet it is not homesickness that troubles me when I gaze upward. It is remembrance. For it was from those same skies that I once descended, with the full might of the Defari hegemony, certain of swift victory against a primitive species. I commanded 900 vessels and nearly 30,000 troops in what our High Council designated Preemptive Pacification Protocol, 19A, a clinical term for what became the bloodiest conflict in recent galactic history. I come from a civilization that prides itself on precision and rationality. We study, we analyze, we predict, and then we act. For 17,000 cycles, this approach had served us well as we expanded our benevolent influence across the stars, until we encountered Earth. Our intelligence corps had analyzed human broadcasts for nearly 50 Earth years before the High Council authorized intervention. The data painted a troubling picture, a fractured species with territorial disputes, resource competition, and most concerning of all, a biological predisposition toward violence that our predictive models deemed incompatible with stable interstellar civilization. Their males, in particular, exhibited aggressive tendencies that alarmed our behavioral scientists. Testosterone-driven competition, dominance hierarchies, and physical confrontation appeared throughout their global culture. From their ubiquitous sports to their entertainment media to their still prominent military organizations, it was the recommendation of the Xenosociological Ethics Committee, which I chaired at the time, that humanity represented a Category C7 civilization, technically capable of reaching neighboring star systems within a generation, but culturally unsuited for peaceful integration into the galactic community. The Defari approach to such civilizations had been refined over millennia. We would demonstrate our overwhelming technological superiority, neutralize their capacity for organized resistance, and implement genetic and cultural recalibration programs to eliminate problematic traits, particularly male aggression, from future generations. We had performed this service for 11 other species, all of which were now productive members of the hegemony. I volunteered to command the 3rd Fleet in what was projected to be my final field assignment before elevation to the High Council. The operation was scheduled to last 3 Earth months, with minimal Defari casualties and the complete pacification of humanity's defensive capabilities. How profoundly, catastrophically wrong we were. I write this account from a planet I once sought to conquer, now a home I've chosen freely. As the first Defari to request permanent residency after the armistice, my decision bewildered many. But perhaps, after reading this, you might understand why I find humanity, particularly their males, not only fascinating, but worthy of our deepest respect. Our 5 fleets converged on the Sol system in perfect synchronization, emerging from transdimensional space at precisely calculated coordinates. The humans, with their primitive detection systems, had no warning. We bypassed their orbital defense network undetected and positioned our vessels in strategic formations above their major population centers and military installation. The operation began according to protocol, synchronized electromagnetic pulses to disable their communications and power infrastructure, followed by precision strikes against identified military command centers. The first hour proceeded exactly as our simulations had predicted. Human defense systems failed, their communications networks collapsed, and panic spread through their population centers. Then something unexpected happened. Rather than descending into the predicted chaos, sectors of the human resistance self-organized with alarming speed. When we neutralized their centralized command structures, decentralized authority emerged instantly. When we disabled their conventional military assets, civilian infrastructure was repurposed for defense. And most disturbing of all, when faced with overwhelming force, individual humans, particularly the males, did not surrender as rationality would dictate. They fought harder. The first indication that our models had fundamentally misunderstood human nature came during what they would later call the Battle of Pearl Harbor. Our Fifth Fleet had neutralized their Pacific naval installation with minimal effort, destroying their aircraft carriers and amphibious assault vessels while they sat dormant. Victory was total until the counterattack began. Small civilian watercraft, what the humans called fishing boats and pleasure craft, approached our support vessels in seemingly random patterns. Our tactical systems, calibrated to detect military threats, registered these approaches as non-hostile. Then, in coordinated sequence, these civilian craft detonated themselves against our hulls. They were suicide weapons, piloted by ordinary humans who had, within hours of our attack, transformed themselves into warriors. Similar reports flooded in from all theaters of operation. In their Europe, elderly males who had not held weapons in decades retrieved cached firearms and organized neighborhood resistance cells. In their Middle East, traditional tribal rivalries dissolved overnight as former enemies united against us. In their Asia, massive human waves accepted horrific casualties to overwhelm our automated defense systems through sheer numeric sacrifice. Most disturbing of all were the reports from North America, where I personally commanded our most significant force concentration. There, males organized with a speed that defied our understanding of human social structures. Teachers became squad leaders, office workers became demolitions experts, teenagers became effective reconnaissance units, exploiting their knowledge of urban environments to move undetected through our security cordons. By the third day of the invasion, our casualty rates exceeded preoccupation projections by 400%. By the seventh day, we had lost control of 17 major landing zones and 3 command carriers. By the 14th day, the High Council was receiving my urgent communications recommending immediate protocol revision. They did not listen. I will never forget the Earth date April 17th, what became known as the Red Wednesday in both human and Defari historical records. Our forces had secured a strategic position in what humans called the Rocky Mountains, establishing a forwarding operating base from which to pacify the western territories of their United States. Our intelligence indicated minimal resistance capacity in the region. The human settlements were scattered, their military presence limited to a few isolated bases that our initial strikes had neutralized. According to our cultural analysis, these Western Americans would prioritize individual survival over collective defense. Their cultural mythology emphasized self-reliance rather than coordinated action. Again, we were wrong. The attack began at dawn, not with advanced weaponry, but with something far more primitive and terrifying. Thousands of human males on native quadrupedal mounts and repurposed civilian vehicles swarmed our western perimeter. They carried a mixture of military and civilian weapons, some using agricultural equipment modified for combat. Their advance had no central command that we could detect. It was a spontaneous, massive uprising, coordinated through methods our surveillance couldn't intercept. What followed was not warfare as we understood it, it was something older, something our species had engineered out of our genetic memory. The humans fought with a ferocity that bordered on self-destruction, yet was tempered with tactical precision that should have been impossible for civilians. They accepted casualties that no rational military doctrine would permit. Yet these sacrifices were never wasted. Each death purchased an advantage, secured a position, or enabled a breakthrough. The battle from our command center, watching in horror as our containment perimeter collapsed sector by sector. When human forces breached the secondary defense line, I ordered a tactical retreat to our orbital support vessels. The order came too late. Their forces had anticipated our extraction protocol and positioned specialized units to target our transport vessels. 3 of our 5 evacuation ships were destroyed before clearing the atmosphere. My own command shuttle was disabled by what I later learned was a repurposed mining explosive, detonated by a human who had once been what they call a geology professor. The crash severely damaged my atmospheric circulation system and killed 17 of my crew. I expected death, either from my injuries or at the hands of humans seeking vengeance. Instead, I experienced something that would fundamentally reshape my understanding of this species. Human male, later identified as Dr. Greg Woodrow, a combat medic, stabilized my critical systems using a combination of captured Defari medical technology and improvised human equipment. He treated an enemy commander with the same care he provided to his own wounded, despite knowing I had authorized the attacks that had killed thousands of his people. When I regained consciousness in a human medical facility, I asked him why he had saved me. "Because that's what separates us from animals," he said simply. "Any creature can kill when threatened. It takes a man to choose not to." This was my first encounter with the paradox that would become the focus of my subsequent studies, the domesticated warrior. We Defari, like most spacefaring civilizations, evolved beyond our violent impulses eons ago. Violence is inefficient. Aggression is counterproductive. This is the cornerstone of advanced society, or so we believed. We genetically engineered aggression from our bloodlines over 17 generations until it became a distant memory, a primitive trait discarded like vestigial limbs. Our scientists systematically identified and neutralized the genetic sequences responsible for aggressive impulses, territorial defense instincts, and competitive drives. We considered this our greatest achievement, the transcendence of our primitive nature and the embrace of pure rationality. Without the disruptive influence of aggression, our society achieved unprecedented stability and technological advancement. The male of our species, once the more aggressive gender, as with most sexually dimorphic species, became indistinguishable from the female in temperament. Physical differences remained, but the behavioral distinctions eroded with each generation of genetic refinement. This convergence was celebrated as evolutionary progress, the elimination of unnecessary biological variance. Other advanced civilizations followed similar evolutionary paths. The Zentari removed aggression through selective breeding rather than genetic engineering. The Mythlar achieved it through neural recalibration of each developing infant. The methods varied, but the outcome was consistent. As species advanced technologically, they systematically eliminated the aggressive traits that had once aided survival but now threatened social cohesion. This pattern was so consistent that it became a foundational principle of our xenosociological models. Advanced civilization and aggressive biology were deemed incompatible. Species that retained aggressive traits would either self-destruct before achieving interstellar travel, or would require intervention to advance further. Humans defied this principle in a way that shattered our understanding. They never took the path of biological pacification. Instead, they embraced a paradox that continues to astonish xenosociologists across the federated systems. They domesticated their warriors without removing the warrior itself. Human males, men, as they call them, represent something unique in the galaxy. During my 3 cycles as a prisoner of war at the Montana Rehabilitation Center, I had ample opportunity to observe this phenomenon. The facility housed approximately 300 Defari officers under the supervision of human military personnel, primarily males who had fought against us in the conflict. What I observed there contradicted everything our species had assumed about aggressive biology and advanced civilization. The human males who guarded us were capable of extraordinary violence. Their physical training, combat experience, and even their biological composition optimized them for warfare. Yet these same individuals displayed levels of self-control, ethical restraint, and even compassion that our models had deemed impossible for a species that retained aggressive traits. Most remarkable was how they achieved this integration. Unlike any species we had encountered, humans had developed elaborate cultural systems specifically designed not to eliminate aggression, but to channel it. They called these systems by many names: military discipline, martial arts, sports competition, moral codes, religious practices, rites of passage. But all served the same function: to transform natural aggression into controlled power. This was not the crude restraint of primitive impulses that we had observed in pre-spacefaring species. This was a sophisticated reconciliation of seemingly opposing traits: aggression and compassion, power and restraint, ferocity and gentleness, integrated within the same individuals. Most fascinating of all was the realization that this integration wasn't an evolutionary accident or a transitional stage before aggression was eliminated. It was a deliberate cultural choice, maintained and refined over thousands of years. Humans had repeatedly encountered the same juncture our species had, the recognition that unchecked aggression threatened social stability, but had chosen a fundamentally different solution. Rather than excising the warrior from their genetic heritage, they domesticated him. They created elaborate systems to harness rather than eliminate male aggression. And in doing so, they preserved something our species had sacrificed generations ago: the creative, transformative power that comes from channeling rather than suppressing primal energy. The evidence of this different evolutionary path surrounded me in the rehabilitation center. The human males who had defeated us in combat now maintained perfect discipline in guarding us. The same individuals capable of battlefield ferocity showed restraint when provoked. The warriors who had killed many of my comrades now ensured we received proper medical care, appropriate nutrition, and even access to educational materials. This integration of opposing capacities extended beyond their military. In their civilian society, I observed mechanics channeling aggressive energy into creative problem-solving, builders directing competitive drives toward collaborative projects, and leaders transforming dominance instincts into protective responsibility. Most revealing were their relationships with their offspring. Human fathers, a role that exists in Defari society only as a genetic contributor, actively trained their sons to control and direct their aggressive impulses. They didn't suppress these impulses or punish their expression. Instead, they provided structured outlets: sports, competitions, challenges, while simultaneously teaching ethical frameworks for when and how aggression should be expressed. This observation led me to my most profound realization: what we had identified as humanity's fatal flaw, their retention of aggressive biology, particularly in males, might actually be the source of their most remarkable achievements. The Montana Rehabilitation Center, despite its clinical designation, bore more resemblance to a university campus than a prison camp. Located in a valley sheltered by towering mountains, its architecture blended utilitarian function with an unexpected aesthetic sensitivity. The Defari detainees were housed in structures specifically designed to accommodate our physiological needs: higher atmospheric pressure, specialized lighting to match our visual spectrum, and thermal regulation systems calibrated to our homeworld's parameters. This unexpected consideration initially struck me as a tactical error. Why expend such resources on defeated enemies? In Defari conflict doctrine, captured opponents were maintained in minimal conditions until diplomatic exchange could be arranged. This human approach seemed inefficient, even irrational. It was during my third lunar cycle of captivity that Captain Dwight Link began visiting my quarters. Unlike other human officers who interacted with us only as necessary, Link seemed genuinely curious about Defari perspectives. A tall human with weathered features and penetrating blue eyes that reminded me of our homeworld's primary star, He carried himself with the balanced poise our xenokinesiologists had identified as characteristic of experienced human warriors. "Your people are recovering well," he said during our first conversation, monitoring my reactions through the quantum barrier that separated us. The barrier, a technology of our own design that humans had already reverse-engineered, allowed sound to pass while preventing physical contact. "Is the gravity calibration in your sector working properly now?" Such concern for enemy comfort was unprecedented in my experience. "Why do you care about our comfort, Captain? We invaded your world, we killed your people." His response was not what I expected. Rather than platitudes about human ethical superiority or strategic calculations about prisoner exchange value, he smiled slightly. "Because I don't have to be a monster to defeat one." That statement haunted me. In Defari conceptual frameworks, monster was an ontological category, a thing defined by its inherent nature. Link used it as a behavioral choice, as though monstrosity were a potential within all beings that one could embrace or reject through conscious decision. Our conversations continued over subsequent weeks. Link had commanded human forces during the Battle of Appalachia, where my fleet had suffered its most significant losses. By all logical metrics, he should have harbored intense animosity toward me personally. Instead, he exhibited what appeared to be professional respect. During our fifth conversation, the barrier between us temporarily malfunctioned, a power fluctuation caused by a thunderstorm outside the facility. For approximately 12 seconds, nothing separated us. According to Defari combat protocols, this represented a critical opportunity, a high-ranking human officer vulnerable to an enemy combatant. I remained seated, so did Link. When the barrier re-established itself, he raised an eyebrow. "You could have tried something." "As could you," I observed. He nodded. "We've both seen enough violence, Commander Gatto." That night, I reflected on the peculiar interaction. Why had neither of us attempted to exploit the tactical advantage? For myself, the calculation was partly rational. Any attack would have been futile given the security protocols of the facility, but I was forced to acknowledge another factor. I no longer perceived Link as an enemy to be neutralized. Despite our species difference and recent conflict, I had begun to recognize something akin to what humans called kinship. During our next meeting, I posed the question that had increasingly preoccupied me since my capture. Your species retains biological aggression, yet you've built a complex civilization. Our models suggest this should be impossible. How have you reconciled these opposing forces? Link considered the question carefully. Have you studied human history, Commander? Your broadcasts, your information networks, some historical text provided in our quarters, they show a species with a propensity for conflict that exceeds any spacefaring civilization in our records. He nodded. And what conclusions have you drawn? I hesitated before answering. The weeks of observation had led me to a hypothesis that challenged everything I had been taught about advanced civilization. Quite simply, men are just domesticated warriors, I said finally. Your species, particularly your males, never eliminated their capacity for violence. You've somehow tamed it instead. Link's expression registered surprise, then approval. That's remarkably insightful, Commander. Most off-worlders never grasp that fundamental truth about us. But how? I pressed. How does a species retain such destructive potential without self-annihilation? The men must be trained to harness their inner monster, Link explained, leaning forward. Or, as some of our traditions put it, harness their inner warrior and direct those energies to do good. We don't deny the darkness within us. We acknowledge it, respect its power, and channel it toward constructive purposes. I scoffed at first. Then your species is doomed to eternal conflict? His reply haunts me still. No, Gatto. Your species is doomed to stagnation. When the Arax swarm comes, and they will come, who will stand against them? Those who've forgotten how to fight, or those who've mastered the art of righteous battle? The Arax. A theoretical threat that our deep space monitoring systems had detected at the fringes of the galaxy. Something massive, moving between star systems, consuming all biological material before continuing onward. Our models suggested they would not reach populated regions for at least 700 cycles. That link mentioned them suggested humans had detected them as well. You believe your warrior nature will save you from the Arax? I asked. I believe that eliminating the capacity for controlled violence leaves a species vulnerable to uncontrolled violence, Link replied. Tell me, Commander, when your people encounter a problem, what do? We analyze. We consider alternatives. We implement the optimal solution. And when the optimal solution requires violence, the question disturbed me. In Defari decision matrices, violence was never optimal. It was inherently inefficient, unpredictable, and destabilizing. Yet the success of human resistance against our technologically superior forces suggested circumstances where violence might indeed be the most effective response. We would seek alternatives, I said finally. Link nodded. Even when there are none. That's the difference between us. We can choose peace, but we're not limited to it. This perspective forced me to reconsider key moments from the conflict, particularly the Battle of Denver, where I had personally commanded our forces. We had established a fortified position surrounding the city with automated defense systems creating what our tactical models deemed an impenetrable perimeter. Our objective was to secure the population center with minimal infrastructure damage, demonstrating the futility of resistance to the surrounding territories. The human counterattack defied all rational analysis. Their forces were numerically inferior and technologically outmatched. According to every strategic calculation, they should have surrendered to preserve civilian lives. Instead, they launched what appeared to be a suicidal assault against our strongest defensive position. I watched from our command center as waves of human fighters, many clearly civilians with minimal military training, charged our automated defense systems. The casualties were enormous, exactly as our models had predicted. What the models failed to anticipate was the psychological impact of their sacrifice. As the first wave fell, the second did not retreat as rational actors should. They advanced faster, more aggressively. By the third wave, human combatants were reaching our inner defense perimeter, a feat our simulations had deemed statistically impossible. Most disturbing was their behavior upon breaching our lines. Rather than seeking cover or consolidating their position, small teams of humans, predominantly males, continued towards specific targets with a focused determination that suggested absolute clarity of purpose. They weren't fighting from rage or desperation. They fought with precision, despite the chaos surrounding them. One human in particular remains vivid in my memory. A male of middle age who sustained multiple wounds, yet continued advancing toward our command module's power distribution node. Our security forces fired repeatedly, inflicting what should have been incapacitating damage. He absorbed each hit, adjusted his course, and continued. When he finally reached the node, he detonated an improvised explosive device that disabled our entire eastern defensive grid. The sacrifice of that single human, who we later identified as a civilian engineer with no military background, created a critical vulnerability that allowed their main force to penetrate our position. Within hours, we were forced to abandon the Denver operation entirely. At the time, I categorized such behavior as irrational fanaticism. Now speaking with Link, I began to recognize it as something else entirely. The controlled application of that inner monster he described, channeled toward a specific purpose and willingly embraced despite personal cost. I witnessed something during the Denver siege, I told Link. A human male continued advancing despite sustaining injuries that should have rendered movement impossible. He sacrificed himself to disable our power distribution node. Link nodded. Did you recover his identification? Robert Kitts, civilian, age 42, occupation structural engineer. I knew Bob, Link said quietly. He had 3 children, coached Little League baseball, built furniture as a hobby, completely ordinary man in every respect, until the moment extraordinary action was required. No Defari would sacrifice themselves that way, I admitted. It's contrary to rational self-preservation. That's because you've engineered out the very thing that makes such sacrifice possible, Link replied. The warrior doesn't fight for himself, he fights for others. Bob didn't charge your position because he wanted to die. He did it because he valued something more than his own survival. This concept, valuing something beyond personal survival, existed in Defari philosophical frameworks, but primarily as an abstract principle. We understood collective benefit intellectually, but had eliminated the emotional imperative that might drive an individual to sacrifice for the group. In purging aggression from our genetics, had we inadvertently removed something essential to our capacity for heroism? I shared another observation from the war. During the Battle of Chicago, our forces had deployed biological agents designed to incapacitate human defenders with minimal lasting damage. The dispersal pattern targeted concentrations of military-age males based on our understanding of human combat structures. To our surprise, civilian males of all ages rushed into the contaminated zones to evacuate the incapacitated soldiers, exposing themselves to the same agents despite having no protective equipment. Completely irrational behavior, I told Link. These civilians gained no tactical advantage. Many succumbed to the same incapacitating effects. Yet they continued, wave after wave, until all military personnel had been removed from the affected area. They weren't acting from tactical calculation, Link explained. They were responding to something deeper, what some human cultures call the warrior's code. Protection of the vulnerable isn't a strategic choice, it's a moral imperative for the domesticated warrior. As I related more experiences from the conflict, a pattern emerged. Throughout the war, I had witnessed human males exhibiting behaviors that our models classified as irrational or self-destructive. Civilians running toward danger rather than away from it, individuals placing themselves at risk to protect strangers, ordinary men transforming overnight into effective combatants despite lacking formal training. None of these behaviors made sense within Defari conceptual frameworks. We had evolved beyond such impulses, creating a society where individuals reliably acted in accordance with rational self-interest and collective benefit as calculated by objective metric. Yet the war had demonstrated, conclusively, that there were circumstances where irrational human responses proved more effective than our supposedly superior rationality. Your inner monster, as you call it, I said to Link, seems to enable forms of cooperation and sacrifice that our species can no longer access. By eliminating aggression, we may have inadvertently eliminated something essential. Link nodded. The capacity for violence and the capacity for self-sacrifice are connected, 2 expressions of the same fundamental trait. Your people eliminated both. We've spent thousands of years learning to direct both constructively. This insight forced me to reconsider the entire Defari intervention strategy. We had identified human aggression as a flaw to be corrected, a primitive trait incompatible with advanced civilization. What if it was actually the source of their most remarkable qualities? What if domesticating the warrior rather than eliminating him was the superior evolutionary strategy? During the final phase of the Chicago campaign, I told Link, I observed a human behavior pattern that particularly confused our analysts. When our forces breached civilian shelters, adult males would physically place themselves between our troops and non-combatants, a gesture with no practical defensive value against our weapons. Yet they did it consistently, despite knowing its futility. It wasn't a tactical decision, Link said. It was an expression of the warrior's fundamental nature. the willingness to stand between harm and those who cannot protect themselves. Even knowing they would likely fail, they needed to make that stand. Needed? I questioned. You speak as though they had no choice. Not a choice imposed externally, Link clarified, but one that comes from within. A man who abandons that protective instinct loses something essential to his identity. He may survive physically, but something within him dies. This concept, that failing to express the warrior nature might constitute a form of death beyond the physical, had no parallel in Defari thought. Our species had long ago separated identity from biological impulse, creating a society where individual worth was measured by contribution to collective advancement rather than adherence to instinctual patterns. Yet something in Link's explanation resonated with observations I had made throughout the conflict. Human males seemed to measure themselves not just by what they achieved, but by how they responded when tested. Their concept of identity appeared inextricably linked to their behavior under pressure, particularly their willingness to endure hardship for others' benefit. Your males seem to need opportunities to express this protective capacity, I observed. Without external threats, how does your society prevent these tendencies from becoming destructive? That's the central challenge of any advanced human civilization, Link acknowledged. We've developed countless systems to channel male energy constructively. Competitive sports, challenging occupations, martial arts, military service, first responder roles, even extreme recreational activities. All provide controlled contexts for expressing warrior virtues without destructive outcomes. He described human cultural practices I had previously dismissed as primitive or inefficient. Ritualized competitions that seemed to serve no practical purpose. Physically demanding occupations that could have been automated. Training regimens that deliberately incorporated hardship and stress. All, he explained, served the essential function of domesticating the warrior without eliminating him. A man who has never been tested cannot know his own capacity. Link said, our civilization doesn't try to remove that need for testing. It provides constructive forms of challenge that allow men to discover and develop their strength within controlled boundaries. As our conversation continued into the night, I shared more observations from the conflict patterns of human male behavior that had puzzled our analysts but now made sense within this framework of the domesticated warrior. The tendency of human fighters to risk additional casualties to retrieve their dead. The consistent prioritization of civilian evacuation over tactical advantage. The extraordinary resilience of male-led resistance cells even when victory seemed objectively impossible. What happens to your males who cannot find constructive outlets for these energies? I asked. Link's expression darkened. They often turn destructive toward others or themselves. A warrior nature denied expression doesn't simply disappear, it festers. Much of what you likely interpreted as human dysfunction, certain forms of violence, addiction, self-destructive behavior, stems from warrior energy that hasn't found proper channeling. This perspective suddenly illuminated patterns in human society that our initial analysis had failed to connect. The correlation between lack of constructive challenge and antisocial behavior among human males. The success of rehabilitation programs that incorporated physical challenge and protective responsibility. The stabilizing effect of granting males specific protective roles within family and community structures. So the monster must be acknowledged, not denied, I summarized. Trained, not suppressed. Exactly, Link confirmed. Denying its existence doesn't diminish its power, it only ensures that power manifests unconsciously, often destructively. Acknowledging the monster allows us to direct it purposefully. As dawn approached, ending our longest conversation, I found myself fundamentally reevaluating everything I'd believed about evolutionary advancement. The Defari had assumed that eliminating aggression represented progress toward a more advanced state of being. What if we had instead eliminated something essential to our capacity for growth? Sacrifice, and when necessary, righteous defense. I have one final question, Captain, I said as Link prepared to leave. Given what you've explained, do you believe the Defari approach, genetically removing aggressive tendencies, represents advancement or regression? He considered the question carefully before answering. I believe you've achieved remarkable things through your approach. Your technological development, your social stability, your elimination of certain forms of suffering, all impressive accomplishments. He paused, looking directly at me. But you sacrifice something precious in the process. The same fire that drives men to fight can also drive them to create, to explore, to protect, to transcend limitations. By extinguishing that fire completely, you've gained security, but lost potential. As Link departed, I remained awake, contemplating the implications of our exchange. If he was correct, the Defari intervention had been fundamentally misguided. We hadn't come to save humanity from its primitive nature, but to deprive it of its greatest strength, the domesticated warrior who could channel aggression toward creation rather than destruction. The monster, properly trained, was not humanity's fatal flaw. It was their salvation. As my captivity continued, I was granted increasing freedoms as part of their rehabilitation protocol. The quantum barrier was deactivated for supervised periods, allowing me to observe human training methods firsthand. What they called martial arts, military academies, and remarkably team sports. All of these activities seemed at first glance to be simulations of combat, but they were something more profound. Systematic methods to channel aggression into discipline, to transform violence into protection, to make warriors serve civilization rather than threaten it. Captain Link arranged for me to observe a training session at what they called a Dojava facility, dedicated to teaching combat techniques within a rigid framework of ethical principles. The students ranged from children barely past infancy to adults in their later years. All practiced the same movements with varying degrees of proficiency, under the guidance of an elderly instructor who moved with surprising fluidity despite his advanced age. What struck me immediately was the ritualized nature of the practice. Students bowed upon entering the training space. They addressed the instructor with formalized respect. They practiced lethal techniques with careful control, pulling strikes short of contact during partner exercises. "They're learning to kill," I observed to Link as we watched. "No," he corrected, "they're learning control. The physical techniques are secondary to the mental discipline." I noticed that when younger students executed techniques with excessive force or competitive aggression, the instructor immediately intervened, not with punishment, but with correction. "Control yourself before attempting to control others," he told one particularly enthusiastic young male. This principle, self-mastery as the foundation for external power, appeared consistently across the various training methodologies I observed. Whether in military drills, athletic competitions, or civilian defense courses, the emphasis remained the same. Power without discipline was not strength, but weakness. Most fascinating was their approach to training adolescent males, the demographic our models had identified as most problematic due to heightened testosterone production and neural development patterns that favored risk-taking behavior. Rather than suppressing these tendencies, human society created elaborate channels for their expression. I witnessed a football practice where teenage males engaged in controlled collision sports under the supervision of adult coaches. The activity appeared barbaric at first glance. Young males deliberately impacting each other with considerable force. Yet the structure surrounding this aggression was sophisticated and purposeful. The coach, a massive human male with a voice that carried across the field, stopped the practice repeatedly to correct not just technique but attitude. When one young player exhibited excessive celebration after overpowering an opponent, the coach pulled him aside. "That's not what we're about," I heard him say. "Strength isn't for domination, it's for contribution. You're strong so the team can be strong, not so you can feel superior." This concept, personal power developed for collective benefit rather than individual dominance, appeared consistently throughout human training systems. Their males weren't taught to suppress their strength, but to direct it purposefully, always within ethical boundaries that emphasized protection over predation. Later, I observed military training exercises where this principle reached its most refined expression. Human males subjected themselves to extraordinary physical and psychological stress. Sleep deprivation, extreme environmental conditions, simulated combat scenarios, all designed to reveal and then transcend their limitations. What our models had failed to recognize was the moral framework surrounding this training. The soldiers weren't simply learning to fight effectively, they were internalizing a code that specified when, why, and how their skills should be employed. The most respected warriors weren't those with the greatest capacity for violence, but those with the greatest control over that capacity. The warrior paradox, Link explained as we watched recruits conducting urban warfare exercises, is that the most effective fighters are often the most reluctant to fight. They understand the consequences better than anyone. I witnessed this paradox embodied in the training cadre. Veterans of multiple conflicts who pushed recruits to develop lethal capabilities while simultaneously instilling the judgment to know when those capabilities should remain unused. They created warriors who could kill effectively but preferred alternative solutions whenever viable. This balanced approach extended beyond formal training into everyday socialization practices. I observed fathers with their sons in public recreation areas, teaching them to regulate their strength based on context, playing gently with smaller children, competing vigorously with peers, and always restraining their full capacity for force except in genuine emergency. What emerged from these observations was a comprehensive system of warrior domestication that operated across multiple societal levels simultaneously. Individual mentorship, family socialization, educational institutions, community organizations, and formal military structures all contributed to the same essential process, transforming male aggressive potential into focused protective capacity. Most remarkable was the voluntary nature of this transformation. Human males weren't coerced into this domestication process. They embraced it willingly, often eagerly. They seemed to recognize intuitively that undisciplined strength was actually weakness, while controlled power represented true mastery. During my third month of supervised access, I witnessed an incident that crystallized this understanding. At a public gathering in a community center near the rehabilitation facility, a physically imposing, intoxicated male became verbally aggressive toward facility staff. The situation escalated until the man began threatening physical violence. Rather than matching aggression with aggression, the security personnel, all trained warriors, responded with measured restraint. They contained the threat with minimal force, neutralizing the man's capacity to harm others without inflicting unnecessary pain or humiliation. What happened next was most revealing. Once the immediate threat had passed, they didn't punish or reject the man. Instead, an older male, later identified as a veteran of multiple combat deployments, spoke to him privately after he had sobered. I wasn't privy to their full conversation, but fragments I overheard suggested the older warrior was offering guidance on channeling aggressive impulses constructively. This interaction epitomized the human approach, recognizing the warrior nature as energy that could be directed rather than a problem to be eliminated. The intoxicated man wasn't ostracized for his aggression. He was offered a path to mastery over it. I came to understand that what looked like contradiction to outside observers, human society's simultaneous celebration of peace while maintaining warrior traditions, was actually sophisticated integration. They didn't compartmentalize these aspects of their nature, they harmonized them. The same male who trained rigorously in lethal combat techniques would gently cradle an infant. The soldier who could function effectively in chaotic battlefield conditions would patiently teach children. The competitive athlete who dominated opponents on the playing field would volunteer to protect vulnerable community members. Most illuminating were my conversations with human males who had experienced combat during our invasion. Many described a common progression. The initial unleashing of aggressive potential during crisis, followed by the challenge of reintegrating that awakened warrior energy into peaceful society after the threat had passed. The hardest battle, one veteran told me, isn't against the enemy. It's the fight for balance afterward, keeping the warrior alive without letting him dominate. This ongoing internal negotiation, maintaining access to warrior energy while preventing it from controlling the whole, seemed central to human male psychology. Unlike the Defari approach of eliminating the warrior impulse entirely, humans committed to the more difficult path of continuous conscious integration. What I had initially interpreted as primitive retention of outdated biological programming, I now recognized as sophisticated psychological technology, maintaining access to the full spectrum of human capacity while developing increasingly refined control over its expression. The humans never bred out their males' capacity for aggression. Instead, they developed complex cultural systems to direct these masculine energies toward constructive ends. Their men built monuments, explored hostile environments, launched themselves to the stars, all driven by the same primal force that once made them fearsome warriors. Perhaps most remarkable was how this approach bridged what appeared to be opposing human values. Their commitment to peace wasn't achieved by eliminating the capacity for violence, but by mastering it. Their celebration of gentleness wasn't at the expense of strength, but through its proper application. Their emphasis on cooperation didn't require the suppression of competitive drive, but its purposeful direction. As I observed more training methodologies, a consistent pattern emerged. The warrior was never denied or demonized, only directed. Physical strength was developed alongside ethical restraint. Combat effectiveness was paired with moral discernment. The capacity to destroy was balanced by the commitment to protect. This balanced development extended beyond formal training programs into cultural expressions. Their entertainment media repeatedly portrayed the ideal male not as one without aggressive capacity, but as one who controlled that capacity precisely. Their mythological and religious traditions emphasized the archetype of the warrior who fights only when necessary and only for just cause. Even their child-rearing practices reflected this integrated approach. Young males weren't punished for exhibiting aggressive energy. They were taught to channel it appropriately. They weren't told their strength was problematic. They were shown how to use it responsibly. They weren't trained to be passive. They were trained to be protective. This nuanced approach, neither glorifying unchecked aggression nor demonizing male strength, created something our models had deemed impossible: domesticated warriors who retained their primal power while developing the wisdom to direct it constructively. The Defari had achieved peace by eliminating the warrior within us. Humans had achieved something far more remarkable: peace through mastery of the warrior, not his extinction. When I was finally permitted to access the human historical archives, I made a discovery that changed my understanding forever. Nearly every significant human achievement, every monument, every scientific breakthrough, every artistic masterpiece was driven by the same qualities that make their men dangerous opponents in battle: tenacity, fierce determination, refusal to surrender. The same fire that fuels their male warriors built their civilizations. The same determination that makes men lethal combatants drives their greatest thinkers, builders, and explorers. Their females possess their own strengths, but it is the domesticated male warrior energy that propelled humanity's most ambitious achievements. My research began with what humans call the 7 wonders of the ancient world: monumental construction projects undertaken with primitive technology that required extraordinary human effort. The Great Pyramid of Giza particularly captured my attention. Built approximately 4,500 Earth years ago, it required moving and precisely positioning stone blocks, weighing up to 80 tons, using only manual labor and simple machines. The logistical challenges alone should have rendered the project impossible, yet human males organized themselves into effective work units, developed innovative solutions to engineering problems, and persisted through decades of physically demanding labor to complete the structure. The same aggressive energy that made them effective warriors, channeled through discipline and collective purpose, enabled them to reshape their physical environment on a scale that defied rational calculation. This pattern repeated throughout human history. The Roman aqueducts, the Great Wall of China, the cathedrals of Europe, all represented the warrior spirit directed toward creation rather than destruction. The same capacity for enduring hardship, for pushing beyond apparent limitations, for refusing to accept defeat, that made human males formidable in combat, made them equally formidable as builders and creators. Most revealing was how human exploration followed the same pattern. When they began expanding beyond their known territories, crossing oceans, traversing deserts, it was predominantly males who led these expeditions. The same individuals who might have excelled as warriors in conflict situations channeled that energy into confronting and overcoming natural obstacles instead. Their exploration of Antarctica particularly illustrated this principle. Small teams of men deliberately journeyed into one of the most hostile environments on their planet, enduring extreme conditions that pushed human physiology to its limits. Many died in the attempt. Those who survived described experiences of transcendence through confronting extreme challenge, the warrior spirit finding purpose in peaceful conquest of natural barriers rather than defeat of human opponents. This pattern continued into their early space program. The astronauts who first ventured beyond Earth's atmosphere were almost exclusively warriors by training. Military pilots who redirected their courage, discipline, and capacity for functioning under extreme stress toward exploration rather than combat. The same qualities that made them effective in warfare made them ideal candidates for confronting the unknown challenges of space travel. When I examined their scientific achievements, the connection became even clearer. Many of their most significant breakthroughs came during periods of conflict or competition, when male aggressive energy was highly activated but directed toward intellectual rather than physical conquest. Their Manhattan Project, the development of nuclear technology, illustrated this pattern perfectly. Faced with existential threat during their Second World War, they mobilized their most brilliant scientific minds in a focused effort to solve seemingly insurmountable technical challenges under extreme time pressure. The project succeeded not just because of intellectual capability, but because those intellects were driven by warrior determination, the absolute refusal to accept defeat. This same pattern appeared in their space race, a period of intense competition between rival nations to achieve milestones in space exploration. The aggressive, competitive impulses that might have expressed themselves through direct conflict were instead channeled into technological achievement. The result was a period of extraordinarily rapid advancement that culminated in humans walking on their moon, an achievement our models had calculated would take them at least another century to accomplish. Even their artistic and cultural achievements showed evidence of this redirected warrior energy. Many of their most celebrated creative works emerged from individuals who exhibited the same intensity, disciplined focus, and willingness to endure hardship that characterized effective warriors. Their composer Beethoven battled progressive hearing loss to create musical works of unprecedented complexity and emotional power. Their artist Michelangelo spent years in physical discomfort, positioned on scaffolding to complete the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Their writer Dostoevsky produced profound literary works while suffering from epilepsy and the after effects of political imprisonment. These weren't warriors in the conventional sense, yet they exhibited the core qualities of the warrior archetype: confronting limitation, enduring hardship, refusing to surrender when faced with obstacles. The same psychological resources that enabled men to function effectively in combat enabled these creators to persist through challenges that would have defeated less resilient individuals. Most revealing was how human males responded to large-scale challenges. When facing natural disasters, pandemic diseases, or technological failures, they exhibited the same focused intensity and capacity for sacrifice that characterized their combat behavior. The warrior energy that made them dangerous opponents in battle made them equally formidable when confronting impersonal threats. I studied their response to a devastating earthquake in a region called Haiti. Within hours of the disaster, men from around their world mobilized to assist. Many of them military personnel, but also civilian males with no formal combat training. They worked tirelessly in dangerous conditions, clearing rubble to rescue survivors, establishing emergency medical facilities, and rebuilding critical infrastructure. The same physical courage, logistical effectiveness, and capacity for functioning under extreme stress that characterized warrior behavior in combat proved equally valuable in disaster response. The men didn't need to learn new skills for this peaceful application of their energy. They simply redirected their existing capabilities toward rescue rather than combat. This versatility, the ability to rapidly switch from aggressive to protective expressions of the same core energy, appeared repeatedly in human historical records. Their males seemed capable of accessing a consistent set of psychological and physical resources, directing them either toward combat when necessary or toward constructive achievement when possible. The Defari approach of genetically eliminating aggressive tendencies had inadvertently sacrificed this versatility. By removing the warrior potential entirely, we had limited our capacity to mobilize intense focus, endurance, and willingness to confront limitation, qualities essential not just for fighting, but for building, exploring, creating, and overcoming collective challenges. The Pyramid of Giza, the first nuclear fission, the Mars colonies, the Jupiter orbital ring, all manifestations of controlled aggression, of domesticated warriors refusing to accept limitations. Human males had built their civilization not by suppressing their warrior nature, but by channeling it toward increasingly ambitious achievements. When I shared these observations with Captain Link during one of our final conversations before my release, he nodded in recognition. "We have a saying," he told me. "Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. The challenge of any sustainable civilization is breaking this cycle. The Defari attempted to break it by eliminating strong men entirely," I observed. "While we've tried to create strong men who remain strong even in good times," Link replied. "Men who channel their strength toward maintaining and advancing civilization rather than dominating others." "Has it worked?" I asked. He smiled slightly. "We're still here, despite your invasion, despite our own internal conflicts, despite the challenges of our environment. The warrior energy that might have destroyed us has instead driven our greatest achievements." As my access to their historical archives expanded, I began to recognize patterns our initial analysis had missed entirely. Human civilization hadn't advanced despite their retention of warrior traits. It had advanced because of them. The same psychological and physical resources that made their males effective in combat drove their most significant accomplishments during peaceful periods. Their greatest feats emerged not from the suppression of male aggressive energy, but from its conscious redirection. The warrior capacity for focused intensity, for pushing beyond apparent limitations, for enduring hardship in pursuit of a larger purpose, all proved equally valuable in construction, exploration, scientific inquiry, artistic creation, and crisis response. When the Defari eliminated aggressive tendencies from our genetic expression, we had inadvertently sacrificed this versatility. We had achieved a certain kind of peace and stability, but at the cost of the psychological resources that might have driven more ambitious achievements. We had limited not just our capacity for violence, but our capacity for transcending apparent limitations in all domains. The humans had chosen a more difficult, but ultimately more fruitful path, maintaining access to their full psychological heritage while developing increasingly sophisticated methods for directing its expression. They hadn't denied or suppressed the warrior within. They had domesticated him, trained him, and put him in service to civilization's advancement rather than its destruction. This insight forced me to reconsider the entire basis of Defari evolutionary theory. We had assumed that eliminating aggression represented progress toward a more advanced state. What if it actually represented the loss of essential psychological resources? What if the human approach, domesticating the warrior rather than eliminating him, was the superior evolutionary strategy? The evidence of human achievement suggested precisely this conclusion. By maintaining access to their full psychological heritage while developing increasingly refined control over its expression, they had created a civilization capable of both peace and extraordinary accomplishment. The domesticated warrior was not a transitional stage on the path to a more advanced state. He was the more advanced state. This realization would fundamentally reshape Defari understanding of evolutionary development and the path toward advanced civilization. The warrior spirit, properly channeled, wasn't humanity's fatal flaw. It was the driving force behind their greatest achievements. After the armistice was signed and I was granted freedom to return home, I made a decision that shocked both my people and many humans. I requested permanent residency on Earth. My reasoning was simple. I wished to study this magnificent paradox further. How does a species retain its primal fire while directing it toward creation rather than destruction? How do they walk the razor's edge between savagery and transcendence? But the true reason goes deeper. When the Arax swarm descended upon the Proxima Centauri colonies, it was the human fleets that responded first. When the Defari homeworlds faced annihilation, it was human male warriors who stood alongside our peacekeepers, teaching them to fight again. The attack came barely one Earth cycle after the conclusion of our conflict with humanity. Our intelligence had detected the Arax approach toward inhabited systems, but our models calculated they would remain at the fringes of the galaxy for centuries. Once again, our projections proved catastrophically inadequate. The Arax moved with a speed and purpose our science couldn't explain, targeting first the vulnerable research outposts in the Proxima Centauri system. These stations, staffed primarily with Centauri scientists and their families, had minimal defensive capabilities. Their purpose was knowledge gathering, not warfare. When the Arax descended, the Centauri response mirrored what ours would have been. They attempted communication, then negotiation, then retreat. None succeeded. The Arax consumed all organic material in their path without discrimination or apparent purpose beyond consumption itself. They weren't malevolent in any recognizable sense. They were simply implacable, like a force of nature rather than a sentient opponent. The distress signals from Proxima reached Earth approximately 72 hours before they reached Defari space. The human response demonstrated everything I had observed about their warrior nature, now directed toward protection rather than conquest. Within hours of receiving the transmission, their military leadership had mobilized response forces. Within days, their ships were en route to the besieged system, not with scientists or negotiators, but with armed vessels and combat personnel. While the Defari High Council was still debating the appropriate analytical framework for understanding the Arax behavior patterns, humans were already fighting to save the Centauri survivors. I monitored the situation from Earth, where I had remained to continue my studies of human society. The tactical data from Proxima confirmed what I had experienced firsthand during our conflict with humanity. When fully mobilized, human warriors possessed a lethal effectiveness that defied conventional metrics. The same aggressive potential that made them dangerous opponents now made them equally formidable defenders. Most remarkable was the speed with which their previous enemies became allies. Barely a year after our forces had fought against humans, Defari diplomatic channels were flooded with human offers of military assistance against the Arax threat. They didn't gloat over our vulnerability or use it as leverage. They simply recognized a common enemy and extended protection. When the Arax altered course toward the Defari homeworlds 3 months later, the response confirmed everything I had come to understand about the domesticated warrior. Human battle groups arrived in our space before the Defari Council had finalized evacuation protocols. Their ships positioned themselves between our civilian populations and the approaching threat, creating a defensive perimeter that would almost certainly mean death for the human forces if the Arax broke through. I received transmissions from former human opponents, warriors I had fought against during our invasion of Earth, who now stood ready to die protecting my species. This apparent contradiction made perfect sense within the framework of the domesticated warrior. Aggression directed toward protection rather than dominance, power exercised in service rather than for control. Most revealing was what happened on the ground when human forces made planetfall on Defari colony worlds. Our species, having bred out aggressive tendencies over 17 generations, found ourselves psychologically unprepared for direct confrontation with the Arax. Even with superior technology, our forces hesitated at critical moments, lacked the neural architecture for effective rapid response under threat, and exhibited systemic incapacity for the focused aggression necessary for survival combat. The humans recognized this vulnerability immediately and adapted their strategy. Rather than replacing Defari defense forces, they integrated with them, typically pairing human warriors with Defari technical specialists. The humans provided the aggressive focus and split-second decision-making capability our species had lost, while Defari personnel contributed the technical expertise to maximize our advanced systems' effectiveness. Most significantly, the humans began training our people not just in combat techniques, but in accessing psychological resources our species had deliberately suppressed. They couldn't restore our genetic heritage, but they could teach methods for simulating the warrior response through conscious practice. They helped us remember what we had chosen to forget. I observed these training sessions remotely at first, then traveled back to the Defari systems to witness them directly. What I saw confirmed my emerging hypothesis. The domesticated warrior represented not a primitive evolutionary stage, but a sophisticated integration that our species had sacrificed in our pursuit of supposed advancement. Human instructors worked patiently with Defari defense forces, teaching not just physical techniques but psychological stances, ways of accessing focused determination, of channeling fear into effective action, of maintaining ethical boundaries even under extreme stress. They weren't trying to make us into mere fighters. They were helping us recover the integrated consciousness of the warrior. "You haven't lost this capacity," I heard one human instructor tell a group of Defari trainees. "You've buried it beneath generations of conditioning, but it remains within you. The capacity to fight when fighting is necessary, while choosing peace when peace is possible." This balance, maintaining access to warrior capacity while exercising conscious choice about its expression, represented precisely what our species had sacrificed. In breeding out aggression, we had inadvertently eliminated our capacity for effective resistance when resistance became necessary for survival. We had achieved freedom from internal violence at the cost of vulnerability to external threat. As the combined human Defari forces gradually contained and then pushed back the Arax incursion, I made my decision. I would not return permanently to Defari space once the crisis passed. I would remain on Earth, studying the domesticated warrior in his natural environment, seeking to understand how humans maintained this precarious but precious balance between primal power and ethical restraint. My reasoning was simple. I wished to study this magnificent paradox further. How does a species retain its primal fire while directing it toward creation rather than destruction? How do they walk the razor's edge between savagery and transcendence? But the true reason goes deeper. When the Arax swarm descended upon the Proxima Centauri colonies, it was the human fleets that responded first. When the Defari homeworlds faced annihilation, it was human male warriors who stood alongside our peacekeepers, teaching them to fight again. Humanity never forgot what we tried so hard to erase. that sometimes survival requires fighting for what matters, that peace must sometimes be defended with force, that the warrior spirit, properly channeled, isn't merely destructive but profoundly creative. The universe is not always kind, it does not always reward pacifism and reason. Sometimes it demands defenders, those willing to face the darkness so others may live in light. Humanity's great insight wasn't eliminating the warrior but domesticating it, training the monster within to serve noble ends. Their method isn't breeding out aggression but harnessing it through discipline, purpose, and love. In my 7 Earth cycles living among humans, I have witnessed fathers teaching sons to control their strength. I have seen male warriors become protectors. I have observed how they channel their masculine aggression into art, exploration, innovation, and yes, when necessary, defense of the innocent. My research has expanded beyond formal observation into direct participation. Under the guidance of patient human instructors, I have begun exploring the buried warrior potential that remains within my own genetic heritage, dormant but not entirely eliminated by 17 generations of selective breeding. I cannot access it with the natural fluidity of human males, but through conscious practice I can simulate aspects of the warrior consciousness. This practice has transformed my understanding not just intellectually but experientially. I now recognize the warrior state not as mindless aggression but as focused integration, a consciousness that unifies rather than divides, that harnesses rather than suppresses primal energy. The domesticated warrior isn't characterized by thoughtless violence, but by precisely the opposite. Violence thoughtfully directed only when absolutely necessary, and only in service of protection rather than dominance. Most revealing has been my observation of human communities during this extended residence. Their males exist in a constant state of dynamic balance, accessing warrior energy when needed, then seamlessly returning to gentler expressions. This capacity for smooth transition between seemingly opposed states enables a versatility our species sacrificed generations ago. I've watched human fathers switch instantly from playful gentleness with children to focused protective alertness when potential threat appears, then back to relaxed engagement when the danger passes. This flexibility, the ability to access the full spectrum of response without becoming trapped in any single mode, represents an evolutionary achievement our models failed entirely to recognize. The humans have a saying, "Hard times create strong men create weak men, and weak men create hard times." The Defari way attempted to break this cycle by creating perfect citizens. The human way embraces the cycle but adds wisdom, training each generation to harness their strength rather than surrender it. This training happens not just formally, but through the everyday fabric of their society. Fathers model controlled strength for sons. Mentors guide young males through the psychological transition from undisciplined aggression to focused protection. Communities provide structured outlets for warrior energy, competitive sports, challenging occupations, service opportunities that allow expression without destruction. Most sophisticated is how they've integrated this process into their cultural narratives. Their stories consistently feature the same archetypal journey: the warrior who learns to control his power rather than being controlled by it. From ancient mythological heroes to contemporary entertainment, this pattern repeats. Not the elimination of the warrior, but his evolution into conscious protector. What the Defari eliminated through genetic engineering, humans achieve through cultural transmission. The domestication of the warrior nature through conscious practice rather than biological alteration. Their approach preserves access to primal power while developing increasingly refined control over its expression. Perhaps the most terrifying thing about humans isn't their capacity for violence, but their understanding of its proper use. They know when to unleash the warrior and when to restrain it, a wisdom we thought unnecessary in our engineered utopia. As the Arax threat grows and more worlds join the human-led coalition, I offer this insight to my Defari brethren. Perhaps it is time we learned from these domesticated warriors, not to become them, but to remember what we've forgotten. The integration humans have achieved, maintaining access to their full psychological heritage while developing conscious control over its expression, represents not a primitive evolutionary stage, but a sophisticated balance our species sacrificed in pursuit of imagined advancement. Their males embody a paradox we once dismissed as impossible. Domesticated warriors who choose peace not from inability to fight, but from the wisdom to recognize when fighting is unnecessary. This balance, retaining primal power while exercising ethical discernment about its use, may represent the true evolutionary achievement. Not the elimination of the warrior, but his conscious integration into the full spectrum of human potential. My continued research suggests this integration extends beyond obvious applications in defense or exploration. The same psychological resources that make human males effective warriors also enable their greatest creative achievements, their most ambitious building projects, their most determined scientific inquiries, and their most transcendent artistic expressions. What we identified as a primitive flaw, the retention of aggressive capacity, particularly in males, may actually represent the preservation of essential psychological resources that drive advancement in all domains. By eliminating these capacities from our genetic expression, we may have inadvertently limited not just our capacity for violence, but our capacity for greatness. The human approach, domesticating the warrior through cultural training rather than genetic elimination, preserves these resources while developing increasingly sophisticated control over their expression. This approach requires constant vigilance, consistent reinforcement, and the acceptance of occasional failure. It is undoubtedly more difficult than our engineered solution, but it may also be more complete. For when darkness comes, as it always does, the universe doesn't need perfect citizens. It needs warriors who remember what they're fighting for. This account is distributed under the authority of the Interspecies Cultural Exchange Program, Earth Year 2219. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave this video a like and subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this. Video shares, memberships, and super thanks help the channel grow as well, so feel free to partner with this channel in that way as we grow. With that all said, thank you again for listening to the story, and thank you for your time. On the left side of your screen are some videos I think you might be interested in. I hope to see you in the next one.